This is a made-up story meant to be fun. Please let us know where you are watching from in the comments before we start. It's always interesting to see how far these stories can go. In the fall of 1893, a routine estate inventory in Crawford County, Pennsylvania, found something that would haunt the area for generations. The mansion, which people in the area called Ash Grove Hall, was 3 miles outside of Meville and could only be reached by a winding dirt road that cut through thick woods. Constructed in 1867 the house belonged to industrialist Cornelius Whitmore, who made his fortune in iron foundries during the Civil War. The building itself was very big, 3 stories of gray stone, 22 rooms, and windows that always seemed to be watching the forest around them. Cornelius and his wife Marguerite lived with their 2 nephews, Silas and Leopold, who had come to live with them after their parents died in a train accident in 1879. According to records from the township, the family got along with the people of Meatville, but they didn't see them very often. They didn't go to church often, bought things they needed through other people, and didn't have any social events. People thought Cornelius was sick, and Margaret liked being alone, which is why they were alone. People were drawn to the property itself. Ash Grove Hall was on 47 acres of mixed woodland and open land. A circular drive led to the main entrance through an avenue of oak trees. Cornelius had planted trees there not long after the building was done. The house had unique architectural features that made it stand out from other wealthy homes in the area. The building had arched windows with detailed stonework, a tower on the east corner that rose a full story above the main roof line, and a slate roof that made it look very European. Local craftsmen who worked on the building while it was being built said that Cornelius was very clear about some design details. Parts, especially those that have to do with the foundation and the cellar. On October 12, 1893, the family's lawyer, Horace Peaton, came to Ash Grove Hall for a meeting to talk about updating Cornelius's will. He saw that the front gate was locked. After 20 minutes of waiting, he went around to the back door and saw that the kitchen door was open. County records would show that what he found inside was one of the strangest domestic events of that decade. The house was in order. There were no signs of struggle, disorder, or a quick departure. The table was set for 4 people, and the silverware was in the right place. A book was open on a side table in the parlor, with the page number 147 marked. There were beds made and clothes hanging in wardrobes upstairs. The family's things were left alone. Margaret's jewelry is in her dressing room. Cornelius's study had a collection of gold pocket watches and a strongbox full of money, but the family was nowhere to be found. All 4 people who lived in Ash Grove Hall had gone missing. County Sheriff Nathaniel Vickers' first investigation was done with careful attention. His report, which is still in the Pennsylvania State Archives, lists a number of strange things that didn't fit with the idea of a normal absence. The family's travel trunks stayed in the attic. There was $300 in cash in a strong box in the study. This was about 6 months' worth of household expenses. It was more unusual to find in the kitchen. 4 plates of food that were only partially eaten are now cold and starting to go bad. The food made it seem like the family had been eating when they were interrupted. But there were no chairs that had been knocked over, drinks that had been spilled, or signs of alarm. Sheriff Vickers talked to the 2 people who worked at the house, Ida Thornquist, the housekeeper who came 3 days a week, and Samuel Dort, the groundskeeper who took care of the property and the horses. They both said that they had last seen the family on October 9th, days before the finding. Ida remembered that Marguerite looked distracted and kept checking the windows as if she was waiting for someone. She said that the lady of the house had spent a lot of time at her writing desk in her private sitting room, and that she had asked A to send several letters to the post office in town, which was strange because Marguerite usually took care of these things herself. Samuel Dorr gave more observations that seemed unimportant at the time, but would later become important. More important. He said that Cornelius had asked him to fix the lock on the wine cellar door, even though it seemed to be working. Cornelius had seemed angry when Samuel looked at the lock and found nothing wrong with it. He said that the lock needed to be replaced with a heavier one. The groundskeeper did what he was told and put in a new lock that was very strong, like the ones used on bank vaults more than on wine cellars. Cornelius had tried the new lock himself several times to make sure it worked well and had the only key with him at all times. During the investigation, the wine cellar stood out in particular. A heavy oak door in the kitchen led to stone steps that went down 15 feet into a brick-lined room that was under the eastern wing of the house. The cellar was unusually big for a home, measuring about 30 feet by 20 feet. The walls showed signs of having been reinforced with extra masonry after the house was built. Sheriff Vickers said in his report that the temperature in the cellar was much colder than it should have been, even taking into account its depth and the time of year. There was a draft in the room, but it wasn't clear right away where it was coming from. In the cellar, investigators found the family's wine collection neatly arranged on racks along 3 walls. The collection was small but nice, mostly French and Portuguese wines with a few bottles of old brandy. The bottles didn't look like they had been moved around recently. But the 4th wall of the cellar had something strange on it. There was a second door in the masonry that was smaller and less well-built than the main entrance. The family couldn't find a key for this door, which was locked. When it was forced open, it revealed a narrow passage that went about 20 feet into the ground and stone before ending at what looked like a bricked-up end. The investigators were confused by the passage. It didn't seem like there was any. No reason for it, and it wasn't tied to any utility or storage need. Stone was used to make the walls of the passage, and wooden supports were put in at regular intervals to keep them from falling down. The floor was made of packed dirt, which showed signs of people walking on it. The soil had been pressed down by people walking on it many times. The brickwork at the end of the passage was fairly new, maybe 5 to 10 years old, and it looked like it had been carefully mortared by someone who knew how to do masonry. Why would someone bother to dig up something like this? Passage just to close it? Sheriff Vickers wrote down the size and features of the passage, but he couldn't come up with a theory about what it was for. People called the county surveyor to see if the passage might lead to a natural cave system, or be an attempt to reach groundwater, but neither explanation was convincing. The passage went in a direction that took it away from any known geological features, and the fact that it ended at a brick wall suggested that it had been intentionally stopped, then giving up because it was too hard. Theories started to come up in the weeks after the person went missing. Some people thought the family had run away to avoid paying their debts, but looking at Cornelius's financial records showed that the estate was in good shape and had no debts. Cornelius's business partner ran the iron foundry, and it continued to make money. Investing in railroad stocks and government bonds made a lot of money without any work. The family's accounts with local businesses showed that they had no unpaid bills. Balances. Some people thought that someone had done something wrong, maybe someone who had taken the bodies away, but there was no sign of violence, and the way the household items were arranged suggested that no one had broken in. Ida Thornquist found something on her last day of work at the house that made things even more scary. While she was cleaning Margaret's writing desk to get the room ready for sale, she found a stack of letters hidden in a drawer that wasn't real. The way that the hidden compartment was cleverly made and could only be opened by pressing a certain panel in a certain order. Ida found it by accident when she tried to take the drawer out to clean it. These letters, which were written between 1889 and 1893, were addressed to Marguerite, but did not have a return address or a signature other than the first letter V. The handwriting was educated and written in a precise copperplate style, but Ida later said it looked like it had been pressed too hard into the paper. Written by someone who is upset or angry. The letters in the estate files showed that the correspondence started off friendly, but became more and more demanding over time. The first letters talked about people they both knew and memories of social events in Philadelphia, where Marguerite had lived before she got married. The author talked about music, books, and friends they had in common in a way that made it sound like they had known each other for a long time. These early letters ended with polite, expressions of hope that they will keep in touch and wishes for Margaret's happiness in her new home. But by 1891, the tone had changed a lot. The letters started to talk about duties and expectations. The writer was unhappy that some things had not been taken care of as promised. There were hints about promises made and how important it is to keep them. The language stayed polite on the surface, but there was an unmistakable sense of pressure underneath. The letters were clearer by 1892. They talked about promises that had been broken and duties that had not been met. They talked about a deal they made with full knowledge and warned of the consequences of willfully ignoring their duty. The writer was upset that their previous messages seemed to have been ignored or brushed off. In a letter from December 1892, it said, "You can't think that silence is an escape. What has been agreed upon still binds you, even if you want to forget it." The last letter. It was written in careful formal language and was very direct. The writer said they were disappointed that previous messages had been ignored and that patience had limits. The writer ended with a sentence that Sheriff Vickers thought was important enough to copy verbatim into his report. "The door must be opened before the moon wanes, or I shall be forced to enter by." Other means, and you know well what follows such necessity. Attempts to trace the source of these letters proved futile. The postmarks indicated they had been mailed from various locations in Pennsylvania and neighboring states, none showing a pattern that might identify the sender. The stationery was of common manufacturer, available from any number of suppliers. The content revealed no specific details that might identify V or explain the nature of the compact being referenced. Handwriting experts consulted by Sheriff Vickers couldn't give any identification, only that the writer had learned to write in the classical style that was common among upper-class people of that time. At the same time, investigators found something else troubling in the family's personal belongings. In Cornelius's study, behind a row of agricultural journals on a high shelf, they found a leather-bound notebook. The fact that it was hidden there suggested that Cornelius didn't want it to be easy to find. The notebook was bound in dark brown leather. The edges were worn from being handled, and the pages were made of high-quality paper that had turned a warm cream color over time. The entries were written by Cornelius between 1889 and 1893, which is the same time frame as the mysterious letters to his wife. This notebook was more like a ledger than a diary because it mostly had dates and short notes. Most of the entries were hard to understand, like "payment made as agreed," or "arrangement continues satisfactorily," remains in effect. However, some entries gave more information and showed that the man was becoming more and more uncomfortable with a situation that was still going on. For example, an entry from November 1891 said, "I question the wisdom of this path we have chosen." Yes, the promised benefits have come true, but at what cost? Marguerite says we have to keep our promises, or else we'll be ruined. But I can't sleep well. I wake up to sounds I can't explain. Last night I heard footsteps in the hallway below. I knew the door was locked, but when I went down to check, everything was fine. The temperature in the cellar had dropped noticeably, and the draft I have never been able to find seemed stronger than usual. In March 1892, Cornelius wrote, "The nephews must never know." Marguerite and I are the only ones who have to carry this burden. They are not guilty of anything that happened before they got here, or of anything that happened before they got here. Let them stay that way. I have done more to make sure that some parts of the house are still off limits to them. The tower room is now locked, as is the cellar. I told them that the foundations need to be checked for water damage. But this is just an excuse. Baumet's entry from July 1893 showed that he was getting more anxious. I have tried to negotiate an end to our obligation, but the response was not encouraging. It seems we are bound in perpetuity unless certain conditions are met. Conditions that seem impossible to meet. I begin to understand that we were never meant to be free of this. The prosperity we have enjoyed, the resolution of our difficulties, all of it came at a price that extends far beyond what we comprehended at the time of agreement. Margaret refuses to discuss alternatives. She maintains that we knew what we were entering into, that we cannot now claim ignorance or seek release. An entry from September 1893 revealed additional detail. I have consulted legal counsel discreetly, framing my inquiry as a hypothetical matter of contract law. The attorney's response was not comforting. He said that certain agreements, especially those with conditional obligations that last a long time, can be very hard to end unless everyone agrees. He also said that if one party has done what they promised and the other has not, courts would usually make them finish the contract. But this is not something for courts to decide, and we both know it. The last entry, written on October 8, 1893, just one day before the family was last seen by their staff, was one line says, "Tomorrow night, we must face what we have put off for too long. May God give us strength." These papers suggested that Cornelius and Marguerite had made some kind of binding agreement, but it wasn't clear what it was or how it had gotten worse over time. The mention of payment, arrangement, and obligation made it seem like there was some kind of ongoing exchange. The fact that the nephews were kept in the dark made it sound like Silas and Leopold might not have known about whatever their aunt and uncle had promised to do. Looking into the family's past more closely uncovered some facts that helped explain things but also made more questions come to mind. Cornelius had a lot of money problems in 1888 because of a labor dispute at his foundry that led to a long work stoppage. Cornelius had tried to cut wages because orders were going down, which is how the fight started. The workers had left, and things had gotten worse when Cornelius hired new workers. There had been violence, and the foundry had to close for 3 months. During this time, the family's situation had become very dangerous. Cornelius had to use up some of his cash reserves and had missed payments on a few notes. But things changed a lot in early 1889. The labor dispute ended suddenly and in Cornelius's favor when the workers agreed to terms that were actually less generous than what they had been fighting for. A new deal with the Pennsylvania Railroad brought in a lot of money, which kept the foundry busy for years. The foundry was able to run at full capacity. In just 1 year, the family's fortunes had completely turned around. Cornelius had grown his business by buying more equipment and getting contracts that his competitors couldn't get. The date of this recovery was exactly the same as the date of V's first letter, and Cornelius's first entry in his secret notebook. It was hard to say that the correlation was just a coincidence. Several business partners of Cornelius also said later that his way of doing business had changed around this time. He had always been careful and conservative, but all of a sudden he was willing to take risks that always paid off. It seemed like he knew a lot about the state of the market and what his competitors were planning, which gave him an almost unfair advantage. Records from the township in 1889 also showed something else. The arrival in Meville of a visitor who stayed at the local boarding house for 2 weeks in February of that year. The County Historical Society kept a record of the boarding house that had the name Virgil Ashbrook on it. It also said that the guest had done business with several local families, but had spent a lot of time at Ashgrove Hall. When Sheriff Vickers talked to the owner of the boarding house, He remembered the visitor as a tall, thin man in his 50s who always wore black and had very pale skin, speaking in a quiet way. The owner remembered that the man had paid with gold coins instead of banknotes, which was an unusual thing that stuck in his mind. There was no record of Virgil Ashbrook in any Pennsylvania census or business directory, which makes it likely that the name was made up. It was impossible to find out where the gold coins came from because they didn't have any unique markings that would have shown where they came from. The owner of the boarding house also said that on the last night of the visitor's stay, he left in the middle of the night without checking out formally. He left payment for his room on the dresser. He had left in the middle of the night, leaving money for his room on the dresser but not checking out until the next morning. The owner thought this was strange, but he didn't look into it any further. When asked about visitors to the house while she worked there, Ida Thornquist remembered that a tall, pale man would come in a plain black carriage once or twice a year, usually in the evening. Marguerite had told her to stay in the kitchen, so she had never met him before. Ida thought it was strange that the family told her to stay in the kitchen during these visits, since they usually introduced her to their rare guests as a matter of courtesy. She remembered that Cornelius always looked tense before these visits and tired afterward. Sometimes he would stay in his study for hours after the visitors left. Ida noticed that the door to the wine cellar was slightly ajar after one of these visits. This was strange because the family usually kept it locked. When she said this, the next morning, Marguerite became angry and said that Ida must have been wrong and that the door was always safe. Marguerite had then gone right away to check the cellar herself. When she came back, her face was very pale, but she didn't say anything else about it. Samuel Dort, the groundskeeper, had more to say about these visits. He remembered that the same coachman always drove the visitor's carriage. This man never said a word and never got off the carriage or came onto the property. The carriage would wait in the roundabout while the horses stood still in an unusual way until the visitor came out. Samuel had tried to talk to the coachman before, but he had not answered. He said the experience was disturbing because the coachman had been looking straight ahead the whole time and never acknowledged Samuel's presence, even when he spoke to him directly. At the time of the disappearance, the nephews Silas and Leupold were both in their early 20s. They gave a different point of view, of questioning. Interviews with a few of their friends in Mobile showed that the young men seemed happy enough at Ashgrove Hall, but they sometimes said they were confused about how their aunt and uncle acted. Silas had told a clerk at the general store that some rooms in the house were always locked, and that his uncle got angry when people asked about them. He had said that one night he found his uncle standing at the locked door of the tower room with a key in his hand, seemingly stuck in a decision about whether or not to go in. Leopold had told the minister after church that he sometimes heard his aunt and uncle arguing late at night, and the arguments would stop as soon as he showed up. He said that he had woken up several times in the early morning to the sound of the front door closing. When he looked out his window, he saw his uncle walking toward the woods at the edge of the property with a lantern. When Leopold asked about, Cornelius said he hadn't left the house and that Leopold had been dreaming about these nighttime trips at breakfast the next day. Both nephews had told friends that they wanted to leave Ashgrove Hall and start their own families. They made it clear that they didn't hate their aunt and uncle and were thankful for the home they had after their parents died. Silas had been studying law by mail and was hoping to eventually get a job with a company in Pittsburgh. Leopold had talked about going to school to study engineering and had shown interest in the field. These plans made it seem like the young men were working toward something in the future, which made their disappearance with their aunt and uncle even more strange. Another piece of the puzzle came from the township's doctor, Dr. Ambrose Carstairs. He said in an interview that Marguerite had come to see him in August 1893 because she was having trouble sleeping and not being able to get rid of feelings of unease. She didn't want to say what was bothering her, but she did ask him if he thought that promises made in certain situations should be kept. When he tried to find out what she meant, she took back the question and asked for a sleep aid instead, which he gave her. She also asked him in a roundabout way if he had ever worked with people who thought they were being watched or followed when no one was seen. Dr. Carstairs had said that these kinds of feelings were often caused by being too tired and had told the patient to get some rest and fresh air. Marguerite went back to see Dr. Carstairs in early October, just a few days before she went missing. She seemed more upset on this visit. She had asked him if he knew of any legal ways for someone to get out of a promise they made years ago. Dr. Carstairs, who was not a lawyer, had told her to talk to a lawyer, but Marguerite had shaken her head and said that some things could not be fixed through normal means. Then she asked Dr. Carstairs a very strange question. Did he think that places could hold memories of things that had happened there, and could those memories affect people who later used those spaces? He had thought this was just a superstitious thought, but Marguerite had seemed to be really upset by the idea. The investigation went on through the fall and into the winter, but it didn't make any progress. The house stayed empty, and the things inside stayed safe in case the family came back, or some other explanation came to light. The court chose Horace Piton to be the family's lawyer and take care of the estate while they were away. He made sure that Samuel Dorr would keep the grounds up and that the house would be safe from vagrants and vandals. During Piton's regular check of the property in December 1893, he found something else. The rooms that Silas said were locked were opened with a set of keys that were in Cornelius's desk. Most of them didn't have anything interesting in them. Storing clothes for the seasons, old furniture, and boxes of business papers. But there was something unexpected in one room on the third floor, at the end of a narrow hallway that looked like it was meant to be missed. The room was small, maybe 10 feet by 10 feet, and there was only one window. The inside of the window was covered with heavy black fabric that was nailed directly to the frame to make sure it stayed in place. Light couldn't get in. There was a table in the middle of the room, and on it was a wooden box that was about 2 feet long and had intricate carvings on it that made it look very old. The carvings showed vines that twisted around each other and what looked like faces or masks peeking out from behind the leaves. The wood was dark, maybe ebony or another rare hardwood, and the deep patina on its surface showed that it was very old. The box was locked, and like the cellar's door, there was no key for it, found among the family's things. When the lock was broken and the box opened, everyone saw that it was empty except for a layer of what looked like ash or very fine dust on the bottom. The inside of the box had stains that looked like they had been there for a long time, maybe from fabric or leather that had gotten worse over time. The stain was strange because it was darker in the middle and faded toward the edges. This made it look like whatever was in the box had been roughly handled. It was shaped like a rectangle and had been in the same spot for a long time. What was even more disturbing was finding writing carved into the inside of the lid. Words carved deeply into the wood in a way that didn't match either Cornelius's or Marguerite's writing as seen in other documents. The carving looked old, maybe as old as the box itself. The letters made words in English, but the style of the writing looked like it was from an earlier century. The writing said, "What is? You have to give back what you borrowed, take back what you gave, and keep your promise. The agreement is in effect until all of its terms are met." This finding made Piton look more closely at the cellar passage. The lawyer's growing concern about the many mysteries surrounding Ashgrove Hall had led him to believe that a more in-depth investigation was needed. He hired a mason named Heinrich Vogel, who was a practical man who had worked on a lot of different building projects in the region and who took his job seriously. Vogel was told to take down the brickwork at the end of the passage to see what was on the other side, if anything. A sworn affidavit was filed with the county court in January 1894 that listed what was found. The passage went on for another 8 feet behind the bricks before opening up into a small, roughly circular room that was about 6 feet wide. It looked like the bedrock that the property sits on had been carved out to make the chamber. The walls had marks from tools that looked like they were dug out slowly and carefully by hand instead of with explosives. At the center, the ceiling was about 7 feet high, bending down toward the walls. There was no flooring in the chamber, just dirt. When the earth was disturbed, bones were found, but they weren't animal bones, which is what you would expect if the chamber had been used for storage or disposal. These were bigger and arranged in a way that made it look like they were put there on purpose instead of thrown away. A doctor came to look at them. Dr. Carster himself said, "They were people." The arrangement suggested 4 people, but the bones weren't complete enough to tell for sure who they were. Dr. Kerr said that the bones looked very old, maybe 20 to 30 years, and that they looked like they had been put in the chamber after the flesh had already rotted, since there was no sign of soft tissue decomposition in the soil around them. The consequences were troubling. The Whitmore family seems to be upstanding members of the community, had kept a room under their house that held human remains. The fact that the brick wall had just been mortared suggested that the bones had been hidden on purpose and not long before they were found. But there were no missing person reports from the area that matched the age of the bones. Dr. Carstairs said that the way the bones looked and felt made him think they might be much older than 30 years, maybe even from the early 1900s or earlier. The end of the 1700s. This discovery changed the investigation, even though it was hard to figure out exactly what it meant. What had been a strange disappearance now seemed like it might have something to do with something much worse. Sheriff Vickers opened the case again with more urgency. There were more and more questions. Who were these people whose bones were found under Ash Grove Hall? How did they pass away? What did these remains have to do with the disappearance of the Whitmore family? Did the family cause these deaths, or did they just inherit them? Dark secret about the property. We looked at records from when Ash Grove Hall was first built in 1867. Cornelius bought the property from a family named Strickland, who had a small farm on the land. The Stricklands had moved west in 1866, and there were no problems with the sale at that time. The Strickland family had owned the land since the 1820s, and it had been passed down through 2 generations. There was nothing strange about the Strickland family's history that researchers found. After the Civil War, regular farmers who weren't rich or poor decided to look for better opportunities in the Western Territories. The digging for the cellar and the building of the passage would have happened during the first phase of building Ash Grove Hall. This suggests that Cornelius or someone working for him designed and built this secret space. A researcher at the County Historical Society found yet another document. In the letter from Cornelius Whitmore to a friend in Philadelphia from 1866 was found in the archives among routine letters from the 1860s. Cornelius talked about his plans for his new home in it and made an interesting reference. "I have followed your advice about the cellar and the foundation. We have followed your instructions to the letter when it comes to the specifications. I trust that this investment will be as good for me as you say it will be. The extra room you suggested has been dug out, as you said. Your drawings and the access passage were built to the exact measurements you gave. As you suggested would be wise, the mason who did this work has since left the area. Who was this partner? What were these requirements? Why would the mason have to leave the area? The letter only had the initials VA on it. The link to V, the mysterious person who had sent Marguerite threatening letters before she went missing, seemed too important to ignore. It was clear that the hidden chamber and its contents were part of the original design of Ash Grove Hall, and were built into the building from the start, not added later. This meant that whatever deal Cornelius had made had happened before he moved into the house, and that the building had been built for a specific purpose related to this deal. More analysis of the bones under the house, on the other hand, revealed more disturbing information. Dr. Cares did a more close look and noted a few strange things about it. The bones didn't show any signs of trauma that would suggest a violent death. It looked like they had been cleaned of tissue before being put in the chamber. The strangest thing was that every set of remains had a small metal object with it. There were 4 identical medallions, each about 2 inches in diameter, made of an alloy that Dr. Carstairs couldn't figure out what it was. The medallions were tarnished, but you could still see the intricate engraving that had been worn smooth over time or from being handled. You could still see the engraving marks when you looked at them closely. Characters or symbols that Dr. Carstairs didn't know how to read. The doctor talked to other doctors at the medical school in Pittsburgh and sent them detailed descriptions and drawings of the medallions. The answer he got suggested that the symbols might be linked to different esoteric traditions that were popular in some groups in the late 18th and early 19th centuries, but it was impossible to say for sure. One person who answered said that similar symbols had been seen in records of some fraternal groups that were popular for a short time in Pennsylvania and other states at that time. Groups that had since broken up or been taken in by more mainstream social groups. The investigation had reached a very important point. The evidence pointed to the Whitmore family being involved in, or at least knowing, about something very wrong that was going on in their home. The letters from V made it seem like this involvement was part of an ongoing duty. It looked like the family had either run away from this duty or, even worse, had completed it. But what exactly was this duty? And how did it relate to the bones in the secret room? An unexpected source gave us a breakthrough. A retired history professor from Allegheny College read about the investigation in the news and then called Sheriff Vickers with information he thought might be related. For years, Professor Ezekiel Hartwell had been looking into the social and religious movements that had spread through Pennsylvania in the first few decades of the 1800s. He knew about different communal experiments, utopian societies, and alternative religious groups that had set up shop in the state's rural areas at that time. Professor Hartwell said that a certain group worked in what was then the frontier region of northwestern Pennsylvania in the 1810s and 1820s. This group called itself the Covenant of Continuance, and their beliefs were a mix of esoteric Christianity, folk magic, and financial speculation, according to Professor Hartwell. The main idea behind the covenant was that certain rituals and agreements could bring about prosperity and success, and that these would hold people together for generations. Members would sign contracts that required not only themselves, but also their children and grandchildren to keep certain customs and pay off certain debts. The covenant had a small but dedicated group of followers among ambitious men who wanted to improve their lives. It promised wealth, power, and safety from bad luck in exchange for regular duties that were never clearly spelled out in the documents that survived. The group had been working in secret, with members using certain symbols and passwords to find each other. Professor Hartwell said that the symbols on the medallions that Dr. Carstairs talked about matched the ones he had seen in incomplete records about the Covenant of Continuance. By the 1830s, the covenant had either broken up or gone completely underground. Professor Hartwell, on the other hand, thought that some of its practices might have continued in a different form among the descendants of the original members. He thought that the bones in the chamber below Ash Grove Hall might be the remains of covenant members who died in the early 1800s and were buried in a way that was in line with the group's beliefs about keeping promises even after death. This information might have helped us understand what was going on with Whitmore. If Cornelius had somehow become linked to the surviving parts of the Covenant of Continuance, maybe through inheritance or being introduced to them by friends, he might have thought he was bound by agreements that were made before he was born. The hidden room under his house, which was built to VA specifications, may have been meant to be a sacred space or a place to keep things related to these. Responsibilities. The mysterious V's visits every now and then could be a sign that these old contracts are being enforced, but this explanation, while giving some background, only made the family's disappearance even more mysterious. What happened on the night of October 9th, 1893, if they had really been bound by such duties? Did they try to get away? Had they run away, or had they finished their last contract obligation? In March 1894, the court said that the 4 Whitmore family members, not present in court, the estate was put into receivership. Ashgrove Hall was hard to sell because of its connection to the hidden chamber and the strange circumstances surrounding the family's disappearance. It stayed empty for a few years, and Samuel Dort took care of it while Peton managed the estate funds and paid him. During this time, rumors started to spread among the people of Meville. At night, people who were driving by the property said they saw lights in the windows, even though the house was empty and locked. People said the lights moved from room to room, like someone was walking through the house with a lamp. Others said they heard noises coming from inside, footsteps on the upper floors, doors closing, and on a few occasions what one witness called voices talking, but they were too quiet to make out words. When asked about these reports, Samuel Dort admitted that he had seen strange things happen that he couldn't explain, while keeping up the property. He said that he had locked doors the day before, but when he got there, they were all open. He said that the temperature in some rooms seemed to change for no reason, even on warm days when it was cold. The most upsetting thing that happened to him was something that happened in the spring of 1894, about 6 months after the family went missing. Dort had gone inside the house to look for water damage after a lot of rain. As he went down the stairs he could clearly hear footsteps above him in the hallway on the 3rd floor, which was the 2nd floor. The footsteps were slow and purposeful, like someone walking from one end of the hall to the other. Dort had quickly gone up to look into it, but there was no one there. There was no sign that anyone had been in any of the rooms. They were all empty and undisturbed. But the sound was so clear that Dort could even tell which way the person had been walking. After the incident, Dort wouldn't go into the house alone and insisted on having someone else with him whenever he had to check the inside. Even then, he only spent as much time inside as he absolutely had to. He later told friends that the house's atmosphere had an effect on him physically, making him feel like there was pressure against his chest, as if the air itself had become heavy. The government officially said that these reports were just the result of local superstition or the wrongly identifying natural events. However, they kept happening often enough that the property gained a bad reputation, which made it even harder to sell. People who looked at the property often said they felt uncomfortable or unwelcome, but they couldn't always explain why. Some people talked about the temperature, saying that the house felt cold even in the summer. Some people said that the sound quality was bad and that it echoed in ways that didn't make sense. The design of the building. A merchant from Pittsburgh finally bought the house in 1897. He planned to use it as a country retreat. He and his family stayed there for exactly 3 nights before leaving without warning. When asked, the merchant didn't give a clear answer. He only said that the house wasn't right for him and that he wouldn't be coming back. The bank got the property back through unofficial means, but more information about the merchant's experience came out. A letter from the merchant said, to a friend who later found out about it in that friend's papers years later, the family had a lot of scary things happen during their short stay. On the first night, the merchant's wife woke up to find the door to their bedroom open, even though she was sure it had been locked and closed. On the second night, the merchant's business partner, who was staying with them to look at the property, said he heard someone moving through the hallway outside his room and stopping at his door for a few minutes before going on. The hallway had been empty when he looked out. The event that led to their leaving happened on the third night. A sound from the floor below had woken the merchant himself just before dawn. When he went down to check, he saw that the door to the wine cellar was open. He had carefully walked up to the cellar, lit a lamp, and then gone down the stairs. There, he saw that the door to the passage was also open. A sound came from inside the passage, a draft of cold air, and a sound that he said sounded like deep, slow breathing. He couldn't see anything in the dark beyond the reach of his lamplight. The merchant had quickly pulled back, woken up his family, and they left the house within an hour, not even waiting for the sun to rise. He wrote in his letter, "I am not a man who is afraid of superstitions. I have traveled a lot and faced many strange situations in my business. But I tell you the truth that what? Standing at the entrance to that passage in the cellar, I felt a presence of such evil and wrongness that my every instinct told me to run away. It was as if the very stones of that place rejected human presence, as if we were trespassing in a space that had been claimed by something that would not tolerate our presence." Eventually, a caretaker named Ezra was hired to take care of the grounds and make sure the building didn't fall into complete disrepair. Donnelly lived in a small cottage on the edge of the property instead of the main house. He was a practical man who had been a soldier in the Indian Wars and was proud of not being sentimental. But even he couldn't shake the strange feeling he got from Ashgrove Hall. In a 1902 interview with a journalist from the Meatville Tribune, Donnelly said that he wouldn't go into the main house after dark. He described feeling N. He felt like he was being watched all the time, especially near the cellar door. He also said that he had found that door open in the morning on several occasions, even though he was sure he had locked it the night before. After the third time this happened, he put in a heavier lock and started checking it several times every night before going to bed in his cottage. Still, the door was found open from time to time, always in the early morning. Somehow, though, Donnelly always had the key with him. He also reported other strange things. He said that on several occasions he saw a figure standing at one of the third-floor windows. The figure looked like a man, but the distance and the quality of the light made it impossible to tell for sure. When Donnelly went into the house to check it out, he found no one there, and all the rooms were locked, as they should be. He started to think that what he was seeing wasn't a person at all. Inside the house, but rather a reflection, or some optical effect of the glass, though this explanation satisfied him only partially. More disturbing were the sounds. On still nights, Donnelly could hear coming from the house what sounded like furniture being moved. The sounds would begin around midnight and continue for perhaps an hour. The scraping of heavy objects across floors, the thud of something being set down, occasionally what might have been voices, though too distant and muffled to make out words. In the morning, when Donnelly would check the inside, and everything would be just as it was, with no signs that anything had been moved. The journal article that came out in October 1902 brought the case back into the public eye. Dr. Marcus Winthrop, a philosophy professor at Allegheny College, became interested in the Whitmore disappearance and spent 2 years looking into it himself. He looked at the case from a philosophical and psychological point of view, trying to understand the case through the lens of belief, commitment, and the power of ideas to shape behavior. His research, detailed in a monograph privately published in 1905, attempted to construct a coherent narrative from the fragmentary evidence. Dr. Winthrop had access to all the documents compiled by Sheriff Vickers, as well as to Professor Hartwell's research on the covenant of continuance. He conducted additional interviews with surviving witnesses and acquaintances of the family. He examined the house itself, spending several nights sleeping in different rooms to get a feel for the atmosphere that had scared away previous tenants. Dr. Winthor's theory, while necessarily speculative, suggested that Cornelius Whitmore had made some kind of deal with a person or group represented by the mysterious V. This deal had apparently been made during or before the building of Ashgrove Hall, and had to do with certain architectural features, especially the hidden chamber beneath the cellar. The agreement had brought Cornelius substantial benefit, especially evident in the resolution of his financial crisis in 1889. His business success, which had seemed almost miraculous at times, could be attributed either to the actual assistance provided by those he had allied himself with, or to the psychological confidence that comes from believing one has secured powerful support. However, this arrangement required ongoing compliance with certain terms, the exact nature of which remained unclear, but which appeared to involve periodic obligations or acknowledgments. The letters from V suggested these obligations had been neglected or resisted. Perhaps Cornelius and Marguerite had initially accepted their role in whatever system they had joined, but over time had grown uncomfortable with it. Perhaps they had attempted to withdraw or modify the terms. The final letter's reference to opening the door might have referred literally to the sealed passage beneath the cellar, or metaphorically to some other way to get in or give up. Dr. Winthry said that on the night of October 9th, 1893, the Whitmore family had to make a choice. They could have tried to run away by taking what they could carry and leaving the house. They could have faced those who had claims on them with unknown results. Or, in the worst-case scenario, they could have willingly taken part in some final requirement of their agreement, disappearing not as victims, but as willing participants in a change, or transition they had always known would eventually come. The professor noted several pieces of evidence that supported different interpretations. The fact that the family had left food uneaten suggested sudden departure or interruption. The fact that they had taken no money, jewelry, or travel necessities argued against planned flight. The open doors in the cellar suggested that something had drawn them below, whether by their own choice or by force. The absence of any trace of them since 1893 suggested either very successful concealment or a fate that made it impossible for them to return. Dr. Winthrop spent a lot of time studying the psychology of binding agreements and how belief can limit behavior. He said that if Cornelius and Marguerite really thought they had to follow their agreement, this belief alone might have made them act in ways that seemed strange to outsiders. They might have thought they had no choice, that resistance was impossible, and that their only options were compliance or consequences too terrible to contemplate. Their nephews, if ignorant of the situation until the final night, might have been swept up in events they didn't understand, faced with choices they weren't prepared to make. The monograph concluded with an observation that reflected Dr. Winthor's growing unease with his own research. In investigating this matter, I have been struck repeatedly by the sense that the evidence itself resists examination. Documents become difficult to access. Witnesses become suddenly reluctant to speak or change what they said before. One starts to think that some truths are not meant to be found out, and that some agreements go beyond the principles involved and include even those who just want to understand. I wonder if knowledge itself can create obligation, and if learning the details of someone else's agreement can make them subject to its terms. Dr. Winthrop stopped his research soon after publishing his monograph. When a colleague asked him, he said he had started having disturbing dreams in which he walked through Ashgrove Hall, down into the cellar and toward the passage. In these dreams, he would hear his name being called from the darkness beyond the passage entrance. The voice was neither threatening nor welcoming, but simply insistent. He would wake up with a strong feeling that he was being called, that something was waiting for him in that hidden chamber beneath the house. More specifically, he. reported that he had found a letter slipped under his office door. The letter, which he claimed to have immediately destroyed, bore the initial V and contained a brief message suggesting that some inquiries were unwise and that discretion in scholarly pursuits was a virtue to be cultivated. The letter had concluded with a sentence that Dr. Winthrop found profoundly unsettling. Knowledge creates connection, and connection creates obligation. Consider carefully whether you wish to be connected, whether this letter was. It is still not clear if what Dr. Winthrop wrote was real or just something he made up. What is clear is that he never wrote about the Whitmore case again and told others not to look into it. When Professor Hartwell tried to talk to him about it years later, Dr. Winthrop got angry and said that the case should be left alone because nothing good would come from looking into it further. The Ash G. Grove Hall property changed hands several more times over the next few decades. Each time, the owners sold the house for a variety of reasons, including that it didn't meet their needs, that they found better opportunities elsewhere, or that they had to move for personal reasons. None of them would admit that the atmosphere of the place drove them away, but several did say, when asked informally by curious neighbors, that the house never felt quite right and that they were never completely comfortable there. In 1923, a fire of unknown origin destroyed the main house. The fire started in the early morning hours when no one was home. By the time nearby residents saw it, the house was already fully engulfed. The Meville Fire Brigade came, but they could only keep the flames from spreading to the nearby woods. The house burned down to its foundation, and the heat was so intense that it cracked the stone walls and caused parts of them to fall down. An investigation into the cause of the fire was inconclusive. The house did not have an electrical system installed, so that source could be eliminated. No lightning had been reported in the area that night. The house had been secured with no indication of vagrants or vandals having broken in. The fire chief noted that the pattern of destruction suggested the fire had started in multiple locations simultaneously, which was unusual for an accidental fire. This observation led to speculation about arson, but no evidence of accelerants could be found, and no one could suggest a motive. The ruins were left standing for several years. The foundation and parts of the stone walls were still there, silently testifying to what Ash Grove Hall had once been. People in the area stayed away from the site. Residents were told not to go near the ruins. Even during the day, few people felt comfortable getting too close. The cellar had mostly survived, but it was full of debris from the floors above that had fallen. In 1927, the property owner hired workers to clear the site completely, with the goal of selling the land for redevelopment. When workers entered the cellar to begin clearing it, they found something that had not been previously reported. The door to the passage stood open, as did the door at the passage's far end. In the hidden chamber beyond, the bones that had been documented by Sheriff Vickers were gone. The earth floor of the chamber showed signs of having been disturbed, as if something had been removed. The 4 medallions that had been found with the bones were also missing. No official investigation was conducted into this disappearance. The workers just wrote it down in their report to the property owner, who chose not to follow up. The cellar was filled with dirt and debris, and the whole site was leveled. In the 1930s, the land was divided into smaller lots and sold for residential development. 3 small homes were built on parts of the original Ash Grove Hall property. In 1952, while digging for a new home on a part of the original estate, workers found something that briefly sparked interest in the old mystery. It was about 50 feet from where. They found a stone marker buried 3 feet below the surface where the main house used to be. The marker had no writing on it, but it was clearly shaped and placed on purpose. It was a rough rectangle of granite about 18 inches long and a foot wide. Underneath the marker, in a small cavity lined with brick, were 4 items carefully arranged: a gold pocket watch with the initials CW, a pearl brooch in the style that was popular in the 1890s, and 2 plain gold rings sized for men. These items matched descriptions of things that belonged to the Whitmore family members. Jewelers' records show that Cornelius Whitmore bought the pocket watch in 1885. The brooch looked like something Marguerite wore to church all the time. The rings looked like those that Silas and Leupold were known to have worn. Their discovery in this location suggested that the family might have put them there on purpose, maybe as a final gesture or offering, or as a marker of some kind. However, there were no human remains in or around the rings. Near the cavity, the meaning of this cache was unclear. The question remained, did the family bury these things before they disappeared, knowing what was going to happen? Did someone else put them there afterward for reasons that are not clear? And what did it mean that these personal items were buried in this specific spot, away from the house but still on the property? The descendants of those who had known the Whitmore family or looked into their disappearance had different ideas. Some thought the family had been the victims of those to whom they were obligated, their bodies disposed of in a location that was never discovered. These personal items buried as a form of memorial or marker. Others thought they had fled under assumed identities to escape whatever dark obligation bound them, leaving behind these possessions as a symbolic severing of ties with their former lives. A few, influenced by Dr. Winthor's monograph and Professor Hartwell's research, entertained the possibility that the family had entered willingly into a fate they had themselves arranged years before, fulfilling the final terms of an agreement that had always pointed toward this conclusion. One researcher who examined the case files in 1968, a graduate student named Laura Brennan, working on a thesis about unsolved disappearances in Pennsylvania history, added a final observation to the record. She noted that in reviewing census data from counties across Pennsylvania for the years following 1893, she had found several families whose arrival and composition matched the Whitmore household. A middle-aged couple and 2 young men in their 20s appeared suddenly in small towns with no clear history and modest means, despite evident education and refinement. In each case, these families had remained for only a few years before moving on, leaving behind little trace of their presence beyond basic official records. In each case, local records noted nothing extraordinary about them except perhaps a tendency toward privacy and an avoidance of questions about their past. The families used different last names in different places, which is not unusual for people who are trying to start over in a new place. Brennan thought that if any of these families had really been the White Sores under fake names, they had successfully escaped whatever had threatened them and had lived the rest of their lives in cautious anonymity, always moving before connections could be made. But Brennan's notes also had a final entry that suggested she had become. Something she found during her research bothered her. She wrote, "I have decided to give up on this thesis topic. As I was looking into the case, I started getting letters from someone who said they were a friend of the families involved. This person who wrote to me strongly disagreed with my research and said that the Whitmore case and a few other similar cases I had found should not be disturbed. The letters were polite but firm, saying that some historical issues are better left alone, that the people involved had made their decisions, and that those decisions should be respected by leaving them alone." She went on to say that the tone of these letters changed from polite discouragement to something more direct. "The last letter I got didn't have any direct threats, but the meaning was clear. If research continues, it won't be welcome, and there could be consequences for doing so. I can't say for sure if this letter is a real threat or just the work of someone who thinks my research is rude or tasteless, but I've decided that this historical puzzle isn't worth the trouble it's caused me. There are many other subjects that deserve scholarly attention that don't come with such disturbing baggage." The Whitmore disappearance case is still officially open, but it is not being worked on in the Crawford County Sheriff's Department archives. The case is on the list of unsolved disappearances, which is a historical. Curiosity is sometimes mentioned in local histories, but most of the time it is forgotten. 3 small homes built in the 1950s now stand where Ashgrove Hall used to be. People who live in these houses say nothing strange is going on, but one family did say that their basement stays cold no matter what time of year it is, even in the summer, and is much colder than the rest of the house. They added more insulation, talked to contractors, and had the HVAC system checked out, looked at many times, but the cold is still there. They've just accepted it as a strange feature of the house and only use that space for storage instead of living. Another person said that their family dog will not go into the basement for any reason. The animal is usually calm and obedient, but when someone gets close to the basement door, it gets upset and pulls against its leash while whining. The family has never pushed the issue. They just accept that the dog won't go for some reason. Down there. They thought it was because of a sound or smell that humans couldn't hear or smell, but that bothered the animal's more sensitive senses. In the Pennsylvania State Archives, the Whitmore file doesn't stand out among the thousands of documented disappearances and unsolved cases from the 19th century. It's just another example of lives that ended or changed in ways that can't be explained. The names, dates, and places are still on file. The physical evidence has been kept safe as much as possible. The letters from V.M. Cornelius's secret notebook, official reports, and an affidavit. No one knows what really happened in that lonely mansion 3 miles outside of Melville on the night of October 9, 1893. Sheriff Vickers, Dr. Winthrop, and Laura Brennan all looked into the case and found a lot of suggestive details that point in different directions, but don't give a clear answer. Proof that makes you think but doesn't answer your questions. A feeling that something important and bad happened, but there is no clear evidence of what it was. There is always a hint in the recorded facts that the truth should stay hidden, because knowing too much can bring with it responsibilities that most people would rather not have. If there are any descendants of the Whitmore family, they have never come forward to claim the estate or tell us what happened to Cornelius, Marguerite, Silas, and Leopold. As far as official records show, the family line ended on that night in October 1893. According to records, it ended that night in October 1893. Whatever they knew, whatever they were afraid of, and whatever duty they had vanished with them into a darkness that has never revealed its secrets. Historians who study the period as a whole sometimes mention the case, but they usually only talk about the basic facts. A well-known family disappeared without a trace, leaving behind a house with strange architectural features and a bunch of strange papers. The parts that are more worrisome: the case, the secret room with its bones and medallions, the threatening letters, the reports of strange things happening at the property. These things are usually downplayed or left out, maybe because people are afraid they will make things too believable or too exciting. But people who come across the case still find it strangely interesting. There is something about the mix of respectability and darkness, as if old duties are getting in the way of modern life. The picture of a family sitting down to an stop dinner and then disappeared completely. These parts make a story that goes beyond just being interested in history. It makes us think about what it means to be obligated, what it costs to be successful, and whether we might sign contracts whose full terms we don't understand until it's too late to back out. Maybe the door to understanding what happened was never meant to be opened. If there was a compact, it might have had terms that went beyond the principles at stake. Provisions that make sure the truth stays hidden as well as that brick wall in the cellar passage did. It looks like some agreements are meant to be kept by not saying anything. Their terms lived on not because they were explained, but because they were so mysterious. In the end, we are left with pieces. Letters that suggest duties, a notebook that shows growing worry, bones in a secret room, a family's things buried in an unmarked place, and a house that was empty and not comfortable for anyone to live in. You can put these pieces together in different ways, each of which tells a different story, but none of them are completely clear. Maybe that uncertainty is part of the plan, a final term of an agreement made long ago that keeps the Whiters and the people they worked with safe, even though they are no longer there. The Whitmore case serves as a reminder that the past has rooms we can't go into, questions we can't answer, and silences that keep going, even though we try our best to break them. Some stories don't end with a revelation. Instead, they end with the idea that there may never be a revelation. Some doors stay closed not because of a physical barrier, but because of the weight of everything that is still unknown pressing against them from the other side.